Part pierna. The new day of war brings not only the sounds of explosions and political statements, but also a strange, almost surreal calm before the storm that is about to unfold on the international stage. The world's attention once again turns to the United States and Russia, two superpowers preparing for another tense round of talks in Miami. Yet, the atmosphere surrounding these negotiations is already charged. While American officials carefully choose their words, preparing new sanctions packages that may come as early as next week, Russian representatives are quietly packing their folders, aware that this weekend may define the next stage of the war. Officially, these meetings are about security guarantees, about stability and dialogue. Unofficially, everyone understands. The future of the conflict in Ukraine and the balance of power in Europe could shift dramatically. But before the main course is served, the world is getting only hints, cautious smiles, vague promises, and whispers that sanctions are ready, just waiting for the right moment. At the same time, across the Atlantic, the European Union is struggling to find common ground. The much-discussed issue of frozen Russian assets has once again divided Europe. For over 14 hours, the leaders of the EU argued in Brussels, some pushing for using Moscow's frozen billions to rebuild Ukraine, others warning about the legal and financial consequences. The outcome? No decision. Belgium held its ground, unwilling to risk retaliation or legal chaos. But, in an unexpected twist, the EU managed to approve a massive €90 billion aid package for Ukraine, interest-free, backed by the EU's own budget. It may not have the drama of confiscated Russian funds, but in practical terms, it's a lifeline. 2 full years of guaranteed financial support for a country still fighting for its survival. And while critics question where the money comes from, the bigger question remains, how long can Europe sustain this unity under American pressure? Meanwhile, inside Russia, new cracks are showing through the official silence. A power outage hits Rostov, one of the cities far from the front line, while in Tolyatti, a massive ammonia plant, critical for producing explosives, bursts into flames. Ukrainian intelligence claims another success. A MiG-31 fighter jet destroyed in occupied Crimea, precision strikes on S-400 missile systems in Belgorod region. Moscow, of course, remains silent, though Russian channels show rising anxiety. These attacks are not isolated. They are part of a coordinated effort to undermine Russia's ability to wage war deep behind the front. In Kiev, military officials share new footage of explosions lighting up the night sky, silent proof that Ukrainian drones and missiles are doing their work effectively. But even as Ukraine's army scores tactical victories, the humanitarian cost of Russia's response grows by the day. Missile and drone strikes continue to pound Ukrainian energy facilities, once again plunging entire regions into darkness. Yet amid the smoke and political maneuvering, there's something else, a deeper story that goes beyond the day-to-day chaos. A young Russian journalist, Anastasia Koshevarova, once close to the Kremlin, publishes a public letter to Vladimir Putin. Her questions sound almost desperate. Why, after nearly 3 years of war, is the Russian army still lacking basic supplies? Why are soldiers dying not only from combat, but from thirst and neglect? Why does chaos reign in the territories that Moscow claims to have liberated? It's a voice from inside the system, frustrated, frightened, yet still unable to question the very foundation of this war. For Putin, such questions may seem harmless, but for millions of Russians quietly listening, they echo something much deeper, the realization that this war is eating away at their country from within. Subscribe to stay informed, because what unfolds next could reshape not only the front lines in Ukraine, but the global political order. The second part of this report will reveal what's truly happening behind those closed doors in Miami, and why both Washington and Moscow are playing a much larger game than anyone dares to admit. Part 2. Behind closed doors in Miami, far from the cameras and the noise of the newsrooms, preparations for the most delicate negotiations between Washington and Moscow since the start of the war are underway. Officially, both sides describe it as a technical dialogue on security guarantees, but insiders admit the stakes are far greater. The American delegation, reportedly led by senior officials including Jared Kushner and Daniel Weiberg, arrived days earlier, coordinating their position with Berlin and Brussels. On the Russian side, the delegation is expected to include Dmitriev, one of the Kremlin's most trusted envoys, a man who has quietly acted as an intermediary in sensitive talks before. The expectation, according to several European diplomats, is that the United States will once again try to push Moscow toward accepting a framework of Western security guarantees for Ukraine. These guarantees would involve the deployment of limited NATO forces on Ukrainian territory, something that Vladimir Putin has long described as a red line. Yet, despite the rhetoric, Russia is still sending representatives, a sign that the Kremlin, however reluctantly, realizes its military and economic options are narrowing. The meeting in Miami is surrounded by unusual secrecy. Even the venue has not been disclosed, though sources suggest it will take place in a government-owned facility near Biscayne Bay. American officials are adamant. This is not a peace conference, not a handshake photo opportunity. It is rather an attempt to prevent escalation, to prevent this war from spiraling further into a global confrontation. But within the Russian delegation, optimism is scarce. According to a senior European official, Russia's envoys have been instructed not to make any commitments, only to listen and report back. Still, Washington's strategy appears to rely on creating a unified Western front, combining diplomatic pressure with the threat of new sanctions that could further isolate Moscow. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent's statement earlier this week hinted at what's coming. We are prepared to implement new sanctions against the Russian Federation as early as next week, depending on the evolution of the situation. The phrase, depending on the evolution, may sound bureaucratic, but in diplomatic language, it means the decision is already made. Only the timing remains flexible. While diplomats exchange rehearsed phrases in Miami, Kiev watches closely. For Ukraine, these talks are both a risk and an opportunity. President Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking to journalists earlier this week, admitted that one of the unresolved issues in the American peace plan concerns the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. The United States proposed a compromise that the station should continue to operate and that its energy production be divided among 3 parties. I told them it was unfair, Zelensky said, referencing discussions with American and European negotiators. The idea of splitting control of a nuclear facility currently occupied by Russian troops between the aggressor and the victim of aggression struck many in Kiev as absurd. Yet this proposal, according to leaked drafts of the so-called final settlement plan, remains on the table. Western diplomats argue it's a temporary mechanism, but Ukrainian officials fear it could become a dangerous precedent, legitimizing Russia's occupation through the back door. As these strategic games continue, another front has opened in Europe, the battle over Russia's frozen assets. The Brussels summit, described by participants as one of the most contentious in recent years, ended without agreement on confiscating Russian state reserves. Belgium's resistance, driven by both legal caution and intense lobbying, blocked the initiative. American envoys had pressured European leaders to move forward, warning that delaying the decision undermines Western credibility. Yet European Council President Antonio Costa tried to spin the outcome as a victory. Standing before reporters after 15 hours of debate, he announced, "We have reached agreement on providing Ukraine with 90 billion euros in support for 2026 and 2027. The loan will be backed by the EU budget, ensuring that Ukraine's urgent financial needs are met. Ukraine will only repay this after Russia fulfills its obligations for reparations." It was a diplomatic compromise. Money without confiscation, solidarity without legal risk. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz went further, calling the package a clear signal to Putin that Europe stands united. However, Beneath the official statements, there's an undercurrent of tension. According to The Times, Donald Trump's team privately warned European governments that any confiscation of frozen Russian assets could backfire if he returns to office. A source close to the former president reportedly told European diplomats that under a future Trump administration, the United States will not support the permanent seizure of Russian state property and could demand compensation from European allies if such assets are used without Washington's consent. The warning, though unofficial, had an immediate chilling effect. In several capitals, particularly in Brussels and London, the message was received as a political threat, a sign that the American political calendar is now directly influencing Europe's decisions on Ukraine. Meanwhile, analysts note that the European decision to issue a loan instead of unblocking frozen Russian assets creates a unique situation. Ukraine now receives crucial funding for the next 2 years, while the reserves of the Russian central bank remain untouched. This means that if, at a later stage, the West decides to seize those assets, the financial potential for supporting Ukraine could double. For Kiev, this is an unexpectedly favorable outcome. For Moscow, however, it's a nightmare scenario, one where both its assets remain frozen and its adversary continues to be funded indefinitely. It's an elegant trap, a European diplomat said off-record. By keeping the assets frozen, we maintain leverage over Russia. By issuing the loan, we show that Europe can act even without unanimity. But in Moscow, state media are already spinning the story differently, framing it as Europe's financial exhaustion and proof that the West is losing patience with Ukraine. Yet, behind that propaganda facade, the Kremlin understands the risk. Economic pressure is mounting, the ruble remains unstable, and industrial capacity is stretched to the limit. The fire at the Tolyatti ammonia plant this week only underscored how vulnerable Russia's critical infrastructure has become. While official channels called it an accident, footage circulating online suggested a precision strike. The plant, one of the largest producers of ammonia in the world, is essential for Russia's chemical and defense industries. Losing even partial production there is a significant blow, not just economically but symbolically. It signals that no facility inside Russia is truly safe anymore. At the same time, the Russian military faces growing logistical chaos. Reports from the front indicate soldiers in occupied territories are struggling with shortages of water, food, and medical supplies. Videos released by Ukrainian drone units show Russian troops collecting dirty rainwater from puddles to drink. The scenes are grim, but they reveal the extent to which Russian logistics have been disrupted by drone attacks and precision strikes. A soldier can survive days without food, but not without water, and the simple fact that Russia cannot supply even that shows the depth of the dysfunction. Inside Russia, the families of mobilized soldiers continue to appeal publicly to Putin, begging for answers about their sons' conditions. Many of these messages are deleted by state-controlled media, but they circulate online, shared by independent journalists and activists who risk their freedom to make them visible. As Western sanctions tighten and military pressure builds, the Kremlin looks increasingly cornered, yet it refuses to change course. Putin's speeches remain defiant, repeating familiar lines about protecting Russian civilization and defending against NATO aggression. But even within his inner circle, frustration is growing. Former loyalists whisper about the cost of isolation, about contracts lost, about projects frozen by sanctions. Oligarchs who once financed the war effort are now quietly moving their assets out of reach, fearing a new wave of restrictions from Washington. The expected sanctions package next week, according to insiders, will target not just energy and banking, but also logistics networks, specifically the so-called shadow fleet of Russian oil tankers. The European Union has already banned dozens of these ships from entering its ports, and now the United States is preparing to go further, pressuring insurance companies and maritime service providers to withdraw coverage entirely. The goal is simple: make Russia's export economy unsustainable. At the same time, intelligence reports indicate that Ukrainian special operations have intensified inside Russian territory. The attacks on the MiG-31 in Crimea and the S-400 systems in Belgorod were not isolated incidents. They were part of a coordinated campaign to weaken Russian air defense infrastructure ahead of the winter months. By forcing Russia to relocate its systems and expend interceptors, Ukraine is preparing the ground for new counterstrikes in early 2026. Satellite imagery analyzed by Western experts confirms that multiple Russian radar and missile installations were hit within a 72-hour window, a scale of precision and coordination not seen since the early stages of the war. For Kiev, these operations serve both a military and psychological purpose, to show that the war is no longer confined to Ukraine's borders. The world is now watching. Europe divided, America cautious, Russia desperate, and Ukraine resilient. What happens in Miami could define the coming year, whether the war drags on or whether a fragile, uneasy truce begins to form. But one thing is already certain: nothing will return to the way it was. The third part of this report will uncover the deeper consequences of these decisions, the financial, political, and human dimensions that will shape not just Ukraine's survival, but the fate of an entire continent. Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe. Your engagement helps keep these stories alive. Part 3. As the Miami talks unfold behind closed doors, the repercussions of each discussion ripple across continents. In Brussels, Berlin, and Warsaw, diplomats refresh their phones every few minutes, watching for the first leaks. Each coded statement, each polite diplomatic phrase carries weight, because the world has learned to read between the lines. When Washington says, "constructive atmosphere," it means nothing was agreed. When Moscow insists, "positions remain unchanged," it means they are buying time. And yet, for all the mistrust and public defiance, the very fact that these delegations are meeting is extraordinary. It signals that even in the midst of total confrontation, both sides still fear the same outcome: a war that spirals beyond control. American negotiators, according to reports from Politico, came with a single demand: that Russia cease missile strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure as a precondition for further dialogue. Russian envoys, in turn, insisted that any conversation about security guarantees must include a promise that Ukraine will not join NATO in the foreseeable future. It is a diplomatic deadlock, but one that both sides pretend can be resolved. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, reality moves faster than diplomacy. The past week has seen one of the heaviest waves of Russian attacks since early autumn. Dozens of drones and missiles targeted critical power plants in Zaporizhia, Mykolaiv, and Cherkasy regions. Over 180,000 civilians were left without electricity overnight, but by morning, Ukrainian repair crews had restored most of the grid. These are the silent heroes of this war, men and women who rush to repair power lines under shelling, who climb poles while the sirens still wail. In Odessa, a strike on the Dniester bridge claimed the life of a mother of 3. Her children survived. The attack, according to local officials, was part of Russia's attempt to cut off western Odessa from the rest of Ukraine by destroying bridges that connect it to the mainland. Ukrainian military analyst Serhiy Flash Beskresnov described it as a strategic effort to isolate the region and disrupt logistics through the Danube corridor. Still, despite repeated strikes, traffic continues. Ukraine adapts. Ferry crossings replace destroyed bridges, engineers rebuild temporary spans, and convoys move under cover of night. The European reaction to these strikes has been swift, if not yet decisive. Within days, the European Union added 41 more vessels from Russia's shadow oil fleet to its sanctions list, banning them from EU ports and services. The United Kingdom followed with its own measures against 24 Russian companies and individuals, including Rosneft, Tatneft, and Rasneft. Together, these sanctions represent one of the most coordinated economic offensives since 2022, though enforcement remains uneven. Some tankers still operate under false flags, carrying sanctioned oil through Asia and Africa. Yet the pressure is mounting, and even Russian officials admit privately that the logistics of exporting oil have become a nightmare. Insurance premiums have skyrocketed. Ship owners are abandoning charters mid-voyage. Every barrel of oil now costs Moscow more to move than it earns in revenue. Inside Russia, the strain shows in unexpected places. Factories that once worked around the clock producing ammunition are facing shortages of components. Local officials downplay the problem, calling it temporary supply issues, but employees post online about unpaid wages and forced overtime. The blackout in Rostov, initially dismissed as a technical failure, turned out to be the result of Ukrainian drone strikes that cut power lines feeding several industrial zones. In Tolyatti, one of the country's largest chemical plants, remains offline after a series of explosions. Analysts note that this particular facility is critical for the production of ammonia, a base component for both fertilizers and explosives. Without it, several defense plants are forced to slow production, and that directly affects the front lines. On those front lines, fighting remains brutal. Deep State and other monitoring platforms confirm that Russian forces have intensified operations near Pokrovsk and along the Kupiansk axis. Though they have made small territorial gains, the human cost is staggering. Ukrainian brigades report repelling multiple mechanized assaults involving BMPs, armored vehicles, and even motorcycles used by Russian storm units. Drones record chaotic scenes of Russian soldiers running across open fields, often without coordination or cover, only to be struck moments later by artillery or FPV drones. It is a grim pattern: massed attacks, minimal results, heavy losses. Yet for the Kremlin, even symbolic advances are vital for propaganda. They need to show progress, any progress, before the year ends. At the same time, stories from inside the Russian army reveal a darker reality. Soldiers are filmed collecting dirty water from puddles, using plastic bottles to scoop mud just to survive. Ukrainian intercepts and independent reports confirm that logistics in many occupied areas have collapsed completely. Supply convoys are intercepted by drones, fuel trucks are targeted before they reach their destination. Even minor medical evacuations now take hours, sometimes days. A viral video shared by Ukrainian units showed two Russian soldiers, visibly dehydrated, wandering in search of water. It captured in one haunting image the collapse of an army that once claimed to be the second most powerful in the world. Corruption adds another layer to the chaos. This week, Ukraine's State Bureau of Investigation announced the prosecution of officers from the 110th Separate Mechanized Brigade, not Russian but Ukrainian, accused of extorting money from their own soldiers. According to investigators, the deputy commander ran a criminal network that demanded payments in exchange for safer assignments, or even for the right to stay away from the front. Those who refused were sent to the most dangerous sectors. The scandal shocked the country, but it also demonstrated something essential. Accountability still exists in Ukraine. The accused were arrested, their assets seized, and the case made public. In Russia, by contrast, such revelations would never see the light of day. The difference between a functioning democracy and a decaying autocracy is not the absence of wrongdoing, but the willingness to confront it. Meanwhile, Europe's financial commitment continues to evolve. The €90 billion loan agreed in Brussels will be distributed in stages, tied to Ukraine's reconstruction projects and defense spending oversight. While critics call it a loan in name only, the symbolic value is enormous. It reassures both investors and Ukraine's citizens that Europe will not abandon them. Germany's Friedrich Merz called it Europe's declaration of strategic patience. Analysts estimate that, when combined with US and IMF contributions, Ukraine will have access to over $150 billion in support by 2027. That means teachers, doctors, soldiers, all will continue to be paid, and the country's economy will keep running despite the war. Yet not all allies are aligned. Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic abstained from additional contributions, citing domestic economic challenges. This division frustrates Brussels, but is not entirely unexpected. Viktor Orban continues to play his balancing act, criticizing sanctions while quietly benefiting from EU subsidies. His government's position has become a test of European unity, one that Brussels will likely address in the coming months through financial leverage rather than direct confrontation. Across the Atlantic, Washington faces its own contradictions. The White House insists on full support for Ukraine, but the shadow of the upcoming US elections looms large. Donald Trump's warnings about frozen Russian assets and his team's behind-the-scenes interference reveal a growing uncertainty about the continuity of American policy. European leaders fear that a change in administration could upend the fragile unity that took years to build. Yet, for now, the Biden administration continues to push ahead with sanctions, military aid, and diplomatic initiatives. The Pentagon recently confirmed another $2.5 billion defense package for Ukraine, including additional air defense systems and interceptors. Each delivery, however, faces delays as US stockpiles run thin and congressional debates over budgets drag on. In Kiev, these political games feel distant. What matters there is survival, of cities, of people, of morale. The night skies are filled with drones, but also with determination. Engineers repair power grids faster than Russia can destroy them. Civilians volunteer to fortify trenches, deliver supplies, or raise funds for the army. Public campaigns, often launched by journalists and bloggers, raise millions in a matter of days. The collective resilience has become Ukraine's most powerful weapon. And while the war shows no sign of ending, the shape of its eventual outcome is becoming clearer. A world where Russia is isolated, Ukraine stands, and Europe learns to live in a new era of confrontation. In Russia, though, the illusion of stability is cracking. Even propagandists, once untouchable, are beginning to question the narrative. Anastasia Koshevarova's open letter to Putin, asking why soldiers lack basic gear, why occupied regions are lawless, why officials steal from their own, struck a nerve. It was shared widely before being quietly suppressed, but its impact lingers. When even loyal voices start asking why the promised order never arrives, it means the machinery of fear is no longer airtight. Putin's annual direct line turned into a performance of evasions, pre-screened questions, rehearsed jokes, and no real answers. The country that once demanded loyalty now runs on silence. Beyond the headlines, there are human stories that rarely reach television screens. The mother of a Russian soldier from the Storm Fee Company travels to the front to find her missing son. She films herself outside a makeshift detention building, saying that officers threatened to kill him if she didn't leave. Her trembling voice, recorded on a cheap phone, spreads online before censors can erase it. In those few minutes of raw reality, Russia's war shows its true face, not heroic, not patriotic, but cruel and indifferent. The voices of families like hers are growing louder, each one eroding the state's carefully constructed myth. And yet, amidst all this despair, there are glimmers of hope. In Ukraine's army, young engineers and drone operators invent new technologies every week. The Defense Procurement Agency has already contracted more than 10 domestic manufacturers for interceptor drones, producing nearly 1,000 units a day. These small, fast devices are changing the battlefield, capable of taking down Iranian-made Shahed drones and Russian Orlan reconnaissance systems. Integrated into the digital coordination platform .Chain Defense, they allow frontline units to request and deploy defense tools instantly. It's a revolution driven not by global corporations, but by local innovators. The war that Russia hoped would cripple Ukraine has instead turned it into a laboratory of resilience. As night falls over Europe, the lights flicker across Kiev, Berlin, and Moscow, symbols of a continent living on the edge of history. The Miami talks may end without breakthroughs, the sanctions may tighten, and the bombs may still fall. But something irreversible has already begun. The world is realigning itself. Old empires are fading,